I'm Michelle Brogan, and welcome to the Allianz Water Expert Podcast series. At Allianz, we're committed to raising awareness about global water challenges and supporting positive change through education, innovation, and collaboration. That's why we created the Allianz Water Hub, a platform where businesses and individuals can learn about the value of water, the risks we face, and the practical actions we can all take to protect this essential resource. Today, I'm going to be talking to Jacob Tompkins OBE, Managing Director of the European Water Technology Accelerator. Jacob is Chief Technology Officer at the Water Retail Company, one of the new water companies in the UK, co-founder of Thunderstorm, an agency that links sport and entertainment with environment, and a visiting professor at Exeter University. Jacob was also the co-founder and director of WaterWise, a UK NGO dedicated to promoting water efficiency and conservation. Jacob is also an officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE, for his services to water conservation. In this episode, we'll be discussing a fascinating and increasingly important topic, the hidden water use behind our digital lives. From Taylor Swift downloads to ChatGPT searches and even cat videos, data centers require huge amounts of water for cooling. This water use is rapidly growing as data demand explodes and is a major concern, especially in water-scarce regions around the world. Jacob will also address key questions such as the impact of data use on water consumption, why some regions are more vulnerable, and what lessons we can all learn from initiatives like the proposed ban on water use in data centers in Utah. Welcome, Jacob.
Wow, that's an introduction. Thank you, Michelle. I need you to do my warm-up all the time.
I can't wait to get into this conversation. It's such an interesting topic, particularly for me, because I work in a large corporate Allianz, and our business is run on data centers. So I can't wait to learn more. So I'm going to start with the first question, which is top of mind, especially for anyone who's listening who's a Swiftie. What do Taylor Swift downloads, ChatGPT searches, and cat videos have in common when it comes to water use?
I'm not singling out Taylor Swift. She is an excellent individual. It's any kind of downloads on Spotify have this. So a ChatGPT search, and ironically, people often search for things like saving water. 10 searches takes 1 liter of water, and then if you're streaming, full Taylor Swift concert for 2 hours. That's 1,000 litres of water. And as I say, other bands are available. So that's Tom Waits, Pink Floyd, Taylor Swift, anyone. And then the old cat videos. Every minute you spend on TikTok, that's a quarter of a litre of water. So if you think about the way on the bus, you see everyone either on Spotify or on TikTok, all of that is using water all the time. These things are amazing in our lives. We use them a lot, but I don't think we think about the consequences that are associated.
Okay. How exactly do data centers use water in their operations?
Okay, so if you think about a data center, just huge racks of computers, effectively, in a big thing that you'd see on like a film, all storing data. Now, if you think about how hot your laptop gets, or your desktop, the amount of heat that's thrown out of that, multiply that up millions and millions of times. That's the amount of heat that's being thrown out by these machines that are storing all of our data. Now, in order to cool that, what they generally do is they use evaporative cooling. So basically water, because it has a very high specific heat capacity, can absorb a lot of heat. And you can tell that when you switch the kettle on at home, and if you've got an energy monitor, you can see the dial shoot round. So heating water and cooling water is very expensive in terms of energy. So what happens is the heat from the data center goes into the water, that then evaporates off, and you lose that water. So in order to cool the data centers, we're using huge amounts of water. That's it, really.
Okay, that makes sense. And why is water by data centers becoming a growing problem globally?
Okay, this is interesting because we're seeing more and more data centers. The majority are in the US, still about 90% of them. But we're now seeing data centers in places like Mexico, And we're seeing them in lots and lots of other places that are water stressed, including, ironically, the Thames Valley, for instance. So there's a lot of data centers proposed in the UK. And by 2030, the amount of water used by data centers will be the equivalent of the amount of water used by the city of Liverpool. So we're talking about a huge amount of water. And then if you're looking at where they're concentrated, particularly in the US, they're quite often in desert states. So Reno. In Reno, there are tax breaks. So Reno now, almost half the city is data centers. There are huge data centers in the desert. So it's to do with where we're placing them and the concentration of those data centers. Data centers like to herd. So they tend to be next to each other for management purposes, for energy supply. So they'll build a new energy grid to supply those data centers. So we tend to get clusters of them. And the impact of that on a catchment or a watershed is enormous. It's like suddenly building a massive new city.
Okay. How are they getting water out to the desert?
So in Reno, it is taking water. Well, that's a really good question. It's taking water from municipal supply. So you can immediately see there are going to be conflicts between the water for the data centers and the water for the towns, and also the water for cooling power stations, the water for growing stuff. It's a major challenge, and it's not just data. I mean, for instance, Elon Musk's mega factory that he was going to build, mega battery factory he was going to build in Berlin, was going to a huge amount of water, and that was stopped by the Berlin authorities. So we're going to get to the point where the clash between really heavy water intensive industry and things like data centers, they're going to clash with water for agriculture, water for human consumption, and water for the environment. I mean, the impact on the environment is huge. But yes, the question you've asked, how are you going to get all that water in the desert? Strangely, these questions aren't being asked. It's where do we get our tax breaks? Are they going to build us an energy grid? There's a lot of space. There's a lot of space in the desert, and it's nice and flat. And if you want to build a huge shed to store data, there you go. Unfortunately, it's also very hot.
Yes.
So it involves even more cooling.
I can see the problem there.
Oh, yeah. And I'm not blaming the people who do the data centers, and I'm not blaming the companies who do it. It's all of us. Where's my... we've on our phones, we've all got loads and loads of apps, all of which use data. Every time you send an email, and then you send a group email and you say, yeah, thanks, I've got that. And everyone else says thanks. And you say, yeah, and you send a smiley face or a thumbs up. Each time you do that, that uses water. And we don't think about that. And really, we shouldn't have to think about that. It's another environmental guilt. But the data impact is huge. And people don't understand this. They don't understand that music downloads and cat videos and all this all contributes to a localized water crisis in a desert in Reno somewhere, or in Mexico, or in other parts of Latin America, in the Middle East, everywhere. It's becoming a growing, I don't like to use a problem, challenge, because I'm sure we'll solve it.
Yeah, I think, we hear people talk about it in the public domain and we hear the big facts, but we don't really understand.
No, people talk about, data center, data use, blah, 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 but they don't say your cat video, which is very funny, is using this much water. And that means that data center, near Reading or near Reno is using this much water. And that is impacting on the amount of water for the river or for humans to use or for other industries. And it's never laid out like that. We always talk about things like biodiversity instead of just plants and animals. We need to spell this out so people can make the choices.
Yes, exactly. It all comes with education.
Which is why the fact you're doing these videos is great. Quick plug for the Allianz videos.
And that's exactly the reason, because it's a topic that I don't think a lot of people in the public domain really understand how they can make changes in order to address the issue.
Scientists and environmentalists love to talk to each other in jargon. And, and then the stuff that comes out at the end of that is just scary. There's a global water crisis, and it doesn't empower people, but explaining it to them properly and then telling them what they can do, that's much more empowering. And we've got that gap between science and the public, and that's why we need more storytelling and more narratives, which quite often use data, ironically.
Yes, definitely we do. How does the water use of data centers fit within the broader competition for water resources worldwide?
Well, that's what we're talking about. So if there's a fantastic graph by the US Geological Survey, and it shows the Earth, the blue planet. So if you look at it, covered in water. But actually, if you take that water off the planet, so the planet is, say, that big, and you put that into a tiny sphere, there's only about that much water on Earth. And then if you think about the water that either isn't salty or isn't locked in deep aquifers or isn't frozen, it's a tiny bit. And then if you think about the available bit, it's a minuscule amount of water that is available for power generation, agriculture, industry, human use, and nature. And if we were on a rocket ship flying through space, which actually we are, and there was a room with all the water in, and it was finite, we wouldn't be doing these things. We'd say, hang on a minute, there's only 3 bottles left in the water room. And this is the difficulty, that we seem to think it's limitless. And people say, yeah, it's the same water, it cycles round. But the difficulty is the way we're messing with the climate and the way we're consuming so much, it is actually a finite resource. And the difficulty we're having now is there's too much water. So, the catastrophic floods we saw in Valencia, too little water. So the drought that we've got in the north of England, for goodness sake, at the moment, all the water is polluted. And we're seeing this around the world. We're seeing microplastics, we're seeing sewerage, we're seeing PFAS. So not only are we depleting the water and messing with the environment so the water moves around in a different way, we're also polluting the little water we have. So we need to look at water use of all of these new industries. It's not just data, it's everything and every way we use it. But when we think about industrial strategy or growth, we need to consider water in that. As I'm saying, if we were on a spaceship and there was only a limited amount of water and someone suggested, yay, let's have a jacuzzi, people might say, well, hang on.
Yeah.
There are challenging, there are challenges for who gets the water first. And then you come into something called cascading failure. So there was a really interesting example in France in 2007, I think it was, where the water level in the rivers had dropped really, really low. And there was a choice between giving water to the town or giving water to the nuclear power stations. And the difficulty there was, if you don't give water to the power stations, you don't have the power to supply the water purification systems. So these failures cascade. And when you see low water levels, it also means that the cooling intakes for power stations fail. So you can get a failure in water that leads to a failure in power, that leads to a failure in agriculture. All of these things are linked together. So if you suddenly throw in another big thing like data centers, it messes with that balance. And the balance is pretty fine already.
Yeah, definitely. And with the growth in digital consumption, it's not really helping matters, really. What could happen if we don't address the water demands of data centers in the context of the global water crisis?
Well, the proportion of water being used by data centers is very, very large and growing. So what we will see is conflicts, as I said, between water for agriculture, water for businesses, water for domestic use, and the environment. And the one that will probably give out of all of those is the environment. So we will trash the environment even more if we're not careful. There are solutions, but we can't just ignore the water and energy impacts of data centers. And that's not telling people to stop watching cat videos. It's just saying we need to be aware of how much that uses and address how we're going to do this in a sustainable way.
What options are there available to reduce water in data centers?
Okay, now that's the interesting bit. So first of all, you could change the cooling method. So you could use a refrigeration-based method, or you could use an air-blowing method, some refrigeration uses water as well, but there are methods that you can use that don't use water. Difficulty with those is they use a lot more power. So you're balancing water against CO2. So that's a difficult trade-off. What you can do, and the first thing I would suggest, is green coding. And that is when you write software, a lot of software engineers, as there's more and more computing power, they make their software more and more complex. Because you've got like a supercomputer, well, then you can run it as many times as you like. You don't need to worry about the capacity, you just run loads and loads. But what you're now having in the green computing movement is they are optimizing their algorithms to reduce the resource consumption of that data and those algorithms. So they're optimizing the way data is stored, they're optimizing the way algorithms run. And that means a lot less energy to do the same thing. So you can still do your Taylor Swift downloads, your cat videos, but they're using 10% of what they were using before. So that green coding, definitely we need. And it may cost more, but also green coding is efficient. It's elegant, it's much more beautifully done. And it's about efficiency. Like we talk about efficiency in energy or water, we need efficiency in coding and we need efficiency in data storage. And then when you get to the physical data centers, there are aspects about where we locate them. So if we locate them in colder climates, there's less cooling. If we locate them in places with more water, then there's more abundance, so you're not messing up that catchment. Or some people have been looking at putting them under the sea, where the ambient temperature is much, much lower, and you're not taking up the land. And then the other options are offsetting. Now, I know offsetting sometimes has a bad name, but both IBM and a couple of others, I know Amazon have been doing this. So what they've been doing is they've been working with water utilities and technology companies, and they've been saying, okay, we're going to build a data center in Paris. But what we're going to do is we're going to work with the water utility in Paris to reduce leaks, for instance. So they would go in and they would say, okay, the data center uses 20 megaliters. We're going to fix 20 megaliters of leaks. So the impact of the data center is no new net water. Now you have to be careful of double counting, and you also have to be careful that it is water neutral within the catchment. So for CO2, it can be water neutral anywhere in the planet. For water, it's very localized. So you can't say, I'm going to fix some leaks in China for a data center in Mexico. It has to be within that same watershed or that same aquifer, underground rock water store, basically. So that's an interesting approach. And then the other one is recycling and reusing the water. So when I was saying before, a lot of cooling is done through water evaporative cooling. So you've got a hot data center, you put water on it, it all evaporates, it cools it down. Well, hang on, we could catch that evaporated water and recondense it and then reuse that in a cooling cycle. And there's quite a lot of this. And I know that Amazon, I think, has pledged to have 100% water reuse by 2030. Again, not that much clarity on whether that is globally or whether it's at a localized level. Some of the big data companies have also talked about buying recycled water. So they would go to another industry, and this is called industrial symbiosis. So let's say you've got a big industry next door that's washing vehicles, and they have a lot of low-grade, slightly polluted water. Well, you could potentially use that. So there are different options there. And then the other one is we could all use less data, but that's unlikely to happen. Oh, sorry. And the other one is reuse the heat. And that, again, depends on location. So you could be using the heat for district heating systems. They're complex to do, particularly well done in Scandinavia, for instance, but I haven't seen them used that much yet with data centers.
Okay. You could
have a nice swimming pool located next to every data center and use the heat to warm the water.
There's no way of catching the evaporated water.
Well, that's the idea. So you can recondense it. So you've got the evaporated water and then you can condense that water so it then runs down. A bit like sort of holding a plate above a kettle. So you condense that water. Obviously, it's still warm and there's an issue with the way the condensate works. But yes, some data centers are looking at that and trying to recycle in a loop.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that sounds good. Are individuals able to reduce their data-related water footprint, or is it more about industry challenges?
It's both. It's always both. It's always very easy to blame big business. And we all love blaming big businesses. But actually, we're the people that consume the stuff. So, there's no point on going on to ChatGPT and saying, how evil are these data companies? Because you're the one using ChatGPT. We're all using that data. So several things you can do. You can think about the amount you do. You can think about, do you really need to send that email? A bit like when people say, do you really need to print this email off? Maybe, do you really need to send that email? So think about your data use, but that's very, very difficult. The other bit is to use green software. So to specifically search out green technologies, green software, green data storage. There are options for that. You'll pay more, as always, but it will help transform the market. And there are potential for data offsets. And also ask your data center, what are you doing? Well, not your data center, your service provider. What are you doing? How is your data stored? All those sorts of questions. So this is a shared issue. Data centers are not standalone. They're not doing this just for the fun of storing data. They're storing our data. So it's all of our responsibility. And, if we want cheap anything, then someone has to pay for it. So, cheap data is being paid for by very high water and energy consumption.
How effective are efforts like water offsetting by big tech companies in tackling data center water use?
Okay, so some of the big tech companies like Microsoft and Amazon and others are looking at working with water utilities, municipalities, and tech companies to offset their water use. So the data center, say, uses 20 megalitres of water. What they can do is work within the catchment or the watershed and find other businesses that are using a lot of water, help them reduce their leaks. Or it could be, you're from Allianz, so they could be working with an insurance company helping houses reduce their leaks. So what that is doing is, reducing insurance risk, reducing damage to houses, reducing the leakage, and offsetting the amount of water the data center's using. So what the data center would say is, okay, we're using 20, 200 megalitres or whatever. We will then offset that by fixing leaks within the same catchment. Now, you have to be careful you're not double counting. You have to be careful it's within the same catchment. Lots of things you have to look at, but there are some initiatives like this, and that's really quite good because it's within the catchment that the data center is in. And they are things like fixing household leaks also contributes to reducing household bills. That's good stuff, but we need to see more of that done, and we need to see it more quickly, and we need to sort of see that standardized.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Utah has pushed for a ban on water use in data centers. What can we learn from that experience, and how have they managed to do that?
They haven't managed to do it yet. The legislation is still going through. It's still being debated. And it's been interesting because the less water you use, the more energy you use. So there are alternatives to water cooling of data centers, but they use a high amount of energy. So they have to be careful that they're not offsetting one environmental problem with another. There are also issues that if they do this, they may push the data centers to other states where it's cheaper and they lose revenue. And then, but the positive issues are what it has done has focused a lot of attention on how you can make water efficient data centers, how you can cool data centers in a different way. And it's focused the mind on that problem. So in my view, this can be solved through consumer action. As I said before, green software legislation and the push for legislation and the engagement of legislators around this, and also the tech companies themselves and new technologies coming in. So there isn't a single, let's make it illegal, or there isn't a single, it's all Amazon's fault, let them sort it out. It has to be everyone acting together in concert.
Yeah, definitely.
Like most problems, really.
What alternative cooling approaches are being explored to minimize water consumption in data centers?
Okay, well, this comes back to what we touched on before. So you can use energy based, but again, if you're not using water that's generally a higher energy, so airflow, all that sort of stuff, as we've said, you can put data centers in cooler places, which therefore are cooler. And that's fairly obvious, but then are the data requirements in those places? What about moving the data around? What about access, physical access to those places? Or there are other issues there. And then there are some people looking at putting data centers under the sea. Again, some issues around access, but quite interesting. So yeah, there are lots of people looking at data centers, and there's also an issue of scale of data center. Is it better to have a big data center, a small data center, distributed storage, concentrated storage? And then there's a multivariate approach to that because costs are different. And again, it links to things like tax breaks, land availability. So it's complex, but there is a lot of work being done on this, except the public don't seem to realize. People don't understand that there's a lot of work going on things like cooling data centers.
Yeah, I think so. Well, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. It's been such a lovely conversation, and I've learned so much now, and I have questions to go back and ask my organization to understand what we're doing about water. But thank you so much for joining.